As a quick disclaimer, The Walking Dead series is a choice-based game where many decisions and the player character's personality are based on choices made in-game. For this video, I will be using my personal playthrough as the base for Clementine's story and personality. Born in Georgia to Ed and Diana, Clementine's early life would be that of a normal girl, going to school, playing with friends, and just being a kid. That would change in just a few months before she turned 9, while at home with her babysitter during an outbreak. An outbreak would start turning the dead into zombies, as well as changing anyone bitten. And her babysitter would be turned in the early stages of the outbreak, with Clementine being forced to hide in her treehouse until a man with an injured leg would stumble into her house and would find a walkie-talkie, and Clementine would be able to talk to him, finding out that his name was Lee Everett. Lee would then be attacked by the zombified babysitter, but Clementine would bring him a hammer, letting him take the zombie down. Lee would then talk with Clementine, convincing her to come with him as it was too dangerous to stay at her home, and they would meet a man named Sean Green who would take them to his family's farm where Lee and Clementine would meet Kenny and his family. And while Clementine talked with Katja, Kenny's son Duck would accidentally run over Sean's leg, and while Lee was able to save Duck, Sean would be killed and his father Herschel would kick them all off at the farm. Now forced to drive, they travel until coming to a convenience store where after a walker ambush they'd be saved and brought in, meeting Doug, Carly, Larry, and his daughter Lily. Larry would have a heart attack after getting in a screaming match with Lee, who would then get the back open for the medicine he needed. However, an alarm would go off, causing a horde to swarm them. Doug and Carly would be grabbed, with Lee only having time to save one and would choose to save Carly. They would then flee to a nearby hotel where they would hold off, eventually finding a man named Mark who was allowed to join the group due to having quite a bit of food, but they would still eventually start to run low. Running low on supplies, and after Lee would take in a teenager named Ben, they would meet a pair of farmers who were offering food for gas. And while they seemed nice at first, it would soon turn out that they had resorted to cannibalism and had fed an injured Mark to the group, with Clementine only not eating it because of Lee's intervention. After being captured, Larry would have a heart attack, and Lee and Kenny, in order to protect the others and to save Kenny's family, would smash his head in with a salt lick before breaking out. With Lee then killing the entire family, the group would find an abandoned car with enough supplies for them to go off of for a time. It was around this time that Clementine would hear a voice on her walkie-talkie, a man who claimed to know her parents as well as where they were. It would ask Clementine not to tell Lee, and wanting to see her parents again, she would agree. Their luck would only get worse as bandits that were getting food from the farmers turned their attention to the group, and they would attack, with a gunfire resulting in a horde attacking the group, and they would be forced to flee, with the motel no longer being safe. Now having lost everything, Lily would snap, accusing Ben of giving the bandits supplies, and after Carly would defend him, Lily would execute her, and as a result, they'd take her gun and leave her on the side of the road. However, things weren't finished, as Kenny's son had been bitten, and Katja, unable to cope, would take her own life. Only a few hours later, the group would pick up the strangers Omid and Krista before entering the city of Savannah, where the stranger would take Clementine and the group would come after her, with Ben being killed, Kenny going missing, and Lee being bitten. Lee would then confront and kill the stranger before using the last of his strength to get Clem to safety. And during this time, Clementine would see the zombified version of her parents, now realizing that they were truly gone. After departing some last bit of wisdom, Lee would ask Clementine to kill him, and Clementine would honor his request, shooting him in the head so he wouldn't turn. Wandering around for a short while, she would be found by Omid and Krista and would stay with them for the next several months. However, tragedy would strike when Omid would be shot by a bandit and the two would survive on their own for 2 years, until Krista would also be killed by bandits, forcing Clementine to run, being left on her own to survive. That is, until being rescued by a group of escaped slaves fleeing a community led by a man named Carver, who Clementine would meet after being left alone for a short while. She would then tell the group, and they would flee up into the mountains, where they would run into yet another group where Clem would reunite with Kenny, who had apparently survived his encounter with the walker horde. For a few hours, they would have time to relax and catch up, but after a walker attack, Carver's group would find them, killing members of both groups, before Kenny and Clementine would surrender, being taken hostage and taken to their camp, an abandoned supermarket. Now first to work, Clementine would witness Carver's cruelty firsthand, seeing him kill a man for failing to do his task and cripple Kenny, destroying his eye. The group would then decide to escape with the help of Mike, Jane, and a member of Carver's group, Bonnie. And together, they'd reach a gate until being confronted by Carver, but after gaining the upper hand, Kenny would beat him to death with a crowbar, which Clementine would choose to stay and watch. Now outside and surrounded by zombies, they would lose 2 more members of their group, including Kenny's girlfriend. Now forced to keep moving, a surviving member of the group, Rebecca, would give birth to Alvin Jr. And the next day, they would be attacked by a group of Russians that Clementine and Jane had robbed to help Rebecca. However, she would pass away at that very moment, turning, and Clementine would kill her to protect the baby. A firefight would then break out with Russians being killed except for one, a young crippled man named Arvo, who pleaded for his survival by claiming to know where a large supply of food was and would lead them there, but not without even more losses. As a result, Kenny would beat Arvo, and growing to fear Kenny, Mike and Bonnie would take Arvo and the food, and after Clementine would catch them, Arvo would shoot her in the shoulder and they would be forced to flee. Kenny and Jane would then take AJ and Clem with a truck, and the two would end up fighting over Kenny's actions, with Jane calling him unstable, but as this happened, they would be surrounded by walkers and would be split up before meeting up, but Jane claimed to lose AJ. Kenny, consumed by rage, would then snap, attacking Jane, and Clementine would try to stop them, but after the fight would escalate with Kenny trying to kill Jane, Clementine would be forced to shoot him. After Kenny's death, Jane would reveal that she had only hidden AJ to show Clementine what Kenny was truly capable of. However, Clementine would see right through this blatant manipulation and would take AJ, leaving Jane alone, now fending for AJ and herself. A few years later, Clementine would join a group known as the New Frontier for safety. However, this wouldn't last long as AJ would get sick, causing the group to write him off as dead. But Clementine wouldn't take this lying down, stealing some medicine to help him out, but she'd be caught and kicked out. However, she would let them keep AJ, knowing that he'd be safer with them after he recovered, or if he did pass, that he'd be more comfortable in the community. Now surviving on her own, she'd meet Javier Garcia, the brother of David, one of the leaders of the New Frontier, and using him would get to David, who would reveal that AJ was alive and would reveal his location. After helping Javi clean up his brother's mess, she would leave for AJ and would then travel to McCarroll Ranch, where she would find it under attack and would go in looking for AJ, but would be forced to kill the survivors after being mistaken for one of the raiders. Then finding AJ and taking him, and over the course of 2 years would teach the child what he needed to know in order to survive. One day, while looking for supplies, the two would be attacked by walkers, but would be saved by a group of kids around her age led by a boy named Marlon. And after a short period of vetting would be welcomed into the group. But the next day, after searching for food, Clementine and her friends Louis and Violet would be ambushed while gathering food. Would be ambushed by a man named Abel while gathering food. But Clementine would push him into the walker horde and would return with the food, which would anger a fellow group member named Brody. That night, Clementine would hear arguing between Brody and Marlon, and after leaving to investigate would find them. But after Brody told Clementine that Marlon had sacrificed 2 members of their group, Sophie and Minerva, to the group Abel had belonged to, Marlon would hit her in the head, killing her. Marlon would try to pin this on Clementine, but she would convince Violet of what Marlon had done, and together they'd talk him down. As Clementine was about to exile him, AJ would shoot Marlon in the head, and while Marlon had betrayed the group, he is no longer a threat when AJ killed him, so he and Clementine would be exiled. As the two were leaving, they would be ambushed by Abel, who had survived but now missing an arm, and Lily, who, surprised at seeing Clem still alive, would become less hostile, but would still try to manipulate her into taking the other kids at the school. But Clementine would refuse and would take AJ and run, but AJ would be shot. They'd then run into a man named James, a former whisperer who had left the group, and together they would attempt to fix AJ up, but without real medical supplies, she knew he would only get worse, and so she'd return to the school to get AJ help, and to warn them about Lily and her group. She was reluctantly allowed to stay and help the group fortify, and over the next 2 weeks, they'd fortify the grounds under her lead. One night, as they waited for the attack, Clementine and Violet would climb up the bell tower and would share a moment with the two confessing their feelings for one another. Right after this, Lily would attack, killing 1 boy and kidnapping 3 others, including Louis. Determined to get her friends back, Clementine and the others would scout out Lily's base, confronting one of their soldiers, who just so happened to be Minerva, Violet's ex-girlfriend and the older sister of AJ's friend, 10. And while she didn't go back with them, she would keep their plan to herself, and that night, Clementine would lead an attack, freeing her friends and fighting Lily herself, and with AJ's help, she would win. However, after telling AJ to spare her life, Lily would kill James and likely would have finished the rest off had a bomb they'd set off not gone off. Clementine would then confront Lily one last time before they'd go their separate ways. Clementine, AJ, Violet, and 10 would then make their way back, but would be attacked one last time by Minerva, who was determined to have 10 turn with her as she was already infected. However, after fighting Clementine, she would end up devoured by walkers, but due to her manipulation, AJ would be forced to kill 10. Clem and AJ would then be separated from Violet, and Clementine would be bitten. And after getting AJ to safety, she would tell him to leave her, not wanting him to make her kill her the same way Lee had asked her to do for him. However, AJ had another plan and would cut Clem's leg off, saving her. The two would then return to the school, and Clementine would end up taking the leadership role. And as far as we know, she stayed there, surviving the apocalypse. Ellie Williams was born 5 to 6 years after the start of the cordyceps mutation that allowed it to infect humans. Growing up in the police state of a federal-controlled quarantine zone, Ellie would grow to idolize the terrorist organization known as the Fireflies. partially due to her relationship with a firefly by the name of Marlene, who was close friends with Ellie's mother, who had died at some point. By the time Ellie was 14, Marley would become the leader and Ellie's best friend Riley would join the group, only deepening Ellie's desire to do the same. One night, Riley would sneak Ellie out of the quarantine zone and the two would explore an abandoned mall together, sharing their first kiss. However, they would be ambushed by infected and both girls were bitten. They would go to Marlene hoping to be taken care of so they wouldn't be a threat to anyone after turning, but even after Riley would turn and be put down, Ellie was still perfectly healthy, discovering that she was a mutant. Marlene, in hopes of developing a cure, would arrange for Ellie to be taken to the hospital and their headquarters in Salt Lake City. However, after a failed attack on Fedra, the quarantine zone would be placed under lockdown and Marlene would be injured. Now unable to take Ellie herself, Marlene would be forced to rely on the aid of smugglers, Tess, and the older brother of the Firefly's former leader, Joel Miller, to take Ellie to a meeting place. After evading Fedra agents, the two would discover Ellie's immunity, and once they'd reached the meeting place, they'd discover the corpse of the people that they had been sent to meet. Tess would grow frantic and would reveal that she herself had been bitten, convincing Joel to take Ellie to his brother, who would know where to take her. Joel and Ellie would then sneak away from the Fedra agents as Tess took a last stand to hold them off. The pair would then make their way to the abandoned town where they would meet Joel's friend, Bill, who owed him a favor, and after being ambushed by infected and finding the body of Bill's partner, would get a car working and would escape the town. Joel and Ellie would then drive until being ambushed and would be forced to fight their way out, with Ellie even saving Joel, and while he'd initially chastise her for not saying back, he would decide to let her help, giving her a gun, trusting her to be his partner. The two would then run into the brothers Henry and Sam, and after a brief scuffle, they'd realize that they weren't part of the group that was chasing them, and they'd agree to work together, escaping but running into infected on the way. After getting to a safe position, Ellie would check in on Sam, trying to comfort her, admitting that her greatest fear was ending up all alone. Waking up the next day, Ellie would be attacked by an infected Sam, who would have to be put down by Henry, who, consumed by guilt, would then take his own life. Ellie and Joel would then continue traveling until meeting Tommy at the settlement of Jackson, where after Joel left, Ellie would meet Maria, who would tell Ellie about Joel's daughter, Sarah, who had died at the start of the outbreak. On top of this, Ellie would begin to suspect that Joel was going to leave her with Tommy and would run off to a farmhouse, where she would be confronted by Joel and the two would get into an argument. And while Joel seemed firm after a brief fight with bandits, Joel would leave with Ellie to the hospital where Tommy believed that the Fireflies were staying. But the place would be abandoned and they would be ambushed by bandits, and Joel would be severely injured, forcing Ellie to take care of him until they got better. While hunting for food, Ellie would meet a man named David, and while they worked together to survive a group of infected, David would accidentally reveal that he was one of the bandits who had attacked them at the hospital. He would then capture Ellie, and she would learn that this was in fact a group of cannibals and that they were planning on making her their next meal. But she would escape and be confronted by David, forcing a fight, but Ellie would get the upper hand, killing him before Joel would come to her aid and they would leave together. Picking back up on the Fireflies trail and traveling to Salt Lake City, they would search for them, but Ellie would be knocked out before they could find them. However, by the time she woke up, she was in a car with Joel, who claimed that there were dozens of other immune people out there, and that none other had produced a cure. Disheartened that all of her sacrifice had been for nothing, Ellie would have her suspicion that Joel was lying, but still caring for Joel would go along with what she knew to be a lie. The two would have several years of a safe and happy life, but eventually Ellie would be unable to live with the lie and would return to Salt Lake City and would find truth of Joel's lie, and after he showed up worried, she would force him to confess, and he would reveal that they could have made a cure, but doing so would have killed her. So he stopped it, killing everyone in his way. Ellie would then break down, ending her relationship with Joel, returning to Jackson. Ellie would then avoid Joel for 2 years until a dance and sharing a kiss with her friend Dina. A drunken resident would call her a slur, and Joel, who happened to be present, would step in, but Ellie would be upset and tell Joel that she didn't need his help, but still caring for him despite his lie, would regret lashing out and would meet him that night, confessing that she wanted to forgive Joel, taking the first step to mending their relationship. Unfortunately, they would never get the chance, as the very next day, Joel and Tommy would be ambushed by the Washington Liberation Front. And while Ellie tried to help, she'd be brought down and Joel would be murdered in front of her. Consumed with rage and grief and having the perfect excuse after Tommy would leave, Ellie and Dina, who was now her girlfriend, would leave for Seattle to avenge Joel, hunting down and killing those with the girl who she learned was named Abby. Things wouldn't be so simple, however, as Dina would reveal that she believed she was pregnant with the child of her previous boyfriend, Jesse. Now forced to go it alone, Ellie would track Abby to an aquarium but wouldn't find her, instead finding 2 of her friends. And Ellie would try to get her location but would be forced to kill them after they attacked, finding out only after the fact that the woman was pregnant. Having a breakdown, Ellie would almost shoot Tommy, who, along with Jesse, had come to get Ellie and take her back. Hiding out for a short while in a theater, but Abby would find them, killing Jesse and shooting Tommy in the head. The two would then fight, but Abby would get the upper hand, almost killing Ellie and Dina, but at the last second, thanks to her friend Lev, Abby would leave, sparing them. Returning home to Jackson, Ellie and Dina would move in together and would raise the baby, but after a while, Tommy would return, realizing that Abby was in Santa Barbara, and while she initially refused that night, suffering from PTSD and unable to move on, Ellie would leave Dina to finish things off with Abby. Tracking her down, finding her captive with a group of slavers, and would fight Abby one last time, but all kayfabe aside, for some reason I honestly don't understand, she would choose not to kill her and would let her leave with Lev. Returning to her home, but finding it empty as Dina had taken the baby with her. Now alone and having no reason to stay, Ellie would leave, with where she was going next not being known. Hello and welcome everyone to the semi-final episode of the second season of my Versus series, where I will be putting one of my favorite and former favorite characters from any media against each other to see who would win between The Walking Dead's Clementine or Ellie from The Last of Us games. As usual, I'm only going off of the games for each character and none of the side material will be taken into account. So with that out of the way, let's start by comparing these two physically. During the final season of the Walking Dead game series, Clementine is a 16-year-old young woman standing at 5 feet 4 inches tall and likely weighing around 100 pounds with a slim build. Being a normal teenage girl, she's likely a fair bit on the athletic side due to the environment she grew up in. However, not so much that I would classify her as a peak human. While strength isn't her best area, she is capable of temporarily holding off walkers and humans in the prime of their lives, and can easily match others around the same size. She can bash open and stab through the skulls or break bones of walkers, or even punch a grown man through a wood railing. Speed is a tough one as she doesn't have many feats, but we know that she's comparable to Minerva, who could react to and pull a walker in front of an arrow after it had been fired, and can keep up with various other survivors in combat. While we don't see Clementine's stamina limit, it can be assumed that her stamina is about average for a normal human, or at the very least is a bit higher due to constantly being in high-stress situations and staying on the move for the better half of her life. Durability is also nothing more than average. She's been knocked out and stunned just like anyone else would be in the same situation, with any above average moments of pain resistance being explained by an adrenaline rush that, again, anyone in the same situation would be going through. By the end of The Last of Us 2, Ellie is a 19-year-old young woman standing at 5 feet 5 inches tall and likely weighing between 90 and 100 pounds with a slim build. Being born and raised in the post-apocalypse, Ellie is understandably in good condition physically, even if she hasn't taken her physicality as far as it could go. Ellie is far from the strongest in her world or even her group, seemingly having to chosen on her marksmanship and blade skills to get by in combat rather than raw strength. However, she still made sure she was strong enough to get by, being capable of holding back infected or survivors long enough to get in some strikes with her knife to break herself apart. Ellie did have a good amount of speed, which in contrast to her average level of strength, leads me to believe that this is the area she actually focused on and relied on outrunning and dodging around infected or weaving in between blows from trained WLF soldiers while getting in cuts with her knife. Her endurance is nothing to look down on. This girl went through 3 days of constant firefights with the WLF, got her shit kicked in by infected as well as Abby Armstrong, and was able to travel across the country with 2 other injured survivors. And in Santa Barbara, got stabbed and fought her way through an enemy compound, killing everyone in her path, before having one last fight with Abby. Ellie is average when it comes to durability. While yes, she takes one hell of a beating throughout The Last of Us 2, I'm confident in saying that there's nothing she goes through that you or I wouldn't also be capable of surviving. This department was pretty surprising, as due to the gameplay difference, I expected it to be a simple check for Ellie, but after researching it, there really isn't much to support that. Neither series depicts their survivors as anything other than humans in relatively good shape, so there's no reason to really compare feats as neither will stand out enough to put them over the other. Their physical builds are very similar, with both being slender young women, and Ellie only has 1 inch over Clem, making it unlikely that Ellie would have any advantage from just their builds alone. Their respective outbreaks are something to consider, however, as Ellie's cordyceps outbreak produced far more dangerous infected than whatever created the undead from Clementine's universe. However, again, it's not like Ellie developed herself to be equal to the infected, as a single runner is capable of overpowering her should it get leverage. While you could argue that Ellie survivors needed to be tougher because of examples like Joel and Abby, who can square up and beat infected to death, those two, unlike Ellie, condition their bodies to be weapons due to their ruthless nature. And I'm sure Walking Dead characters like Negan, Beta, or Mercer could hold their own just fine against Abby or Joel in a fistfight. The last thing here is age, as Clementine is 3 years younger than Ellie, who's had more time to develop, which, while normally an insignificant amount of time, during the age where you're still developing can make a massive difference in physicality. So whether or not Clementine is still growing is an important factor here, and after doing some research, the average age when a girl stops growing is 16. Meaning that even if she is still in development, she is at the tail end of it and may as well be done. So these two should realistically be in the same area of their prime, as neither are going to have any major changes anytime soon. To sum this up, while gameplay had me convinced Clementine stood no chance in this area, it turns out there isn't actually anything to support that. Not feats, not lore, not even biologically. And so I give no edge for physical abilities. As both of the characters have a wide selection of weapons, I will be limiting them both to one close-range weapon, 2 mid-range weapons, and 1 long-range weapon each. With that cleared up, let's see what they get. Also, while Ellie is capable of creating weapons like smoke bombs and Molotov cocktails, these are not part of her standard equipment, so while I will be granting her the ability to craft them, she will not have them at the start of this engagement, and will be needing to gather the materials to make them in the middle of the fight. Also, I will not be granting her health packs, as realistically this wouldn't give her the health boost it does in-game, so there's no real reason to add them. Clementine's close-range weapon was a standard military combat knife, with the average blade for this knife being around 7 inches long, with the handle typically being around 4 inches, giving the knife a total length of 11 inches. Being a single-edged blade with a sharpened point would make this weapon useful for both stabbing and slashing. The handgun she's seen using most in her series is the 6 Sauer P250, which fires 9x19mm parabellum rounds, holds a magazine size of 17 rounds, and fires at a muzzle velocity of 1200 feet per second, with a maximum range of 150 feet. While a lone survivor after leaving the New Frontier, Clementine used a Remington 750. This weapon is a 12-gauge pump-action shotgun with an under-the-barrel feed system capable of holding 4 shells before needing to reload, having a muzzle velocity of 1550 feet a second, and an effective firing range of 130 feet. Clementine hasn't used any weapons considered to be long range. As a replacement, I will be granting her compound bow previously used by Marlin to round things out. With a maximum effective range of 180 feet, this weapon fires arrows to impale an opponent from a distance traveling at 300 feet a second. For close range, Ellie will have her switchblade that was passed down and originally used by her mother, looking to be about a foot long with half of the total length being taken up by the blade. Being a single-edged blade with a sharpened point would make this weapon useful for both stabbing and slashing. Ellie's primary handgun was the Beretta 92 FS, a semi-automatic 9mm pistol with a shortened magazine, holding only 10 rounds, with the standard Beretta having a magazine size of 15, with a muzzle velocity of 1200 feet a second, and effective firing range of 160 feet. Her shotgun was the Remington 870 with a sawed-off stock. This weapon is a 12-gauge pump-action shotgun with an under-the-barrel feed system capable of holding 4 shells before needing to reload, having a muzzle velocity of 1550 feet per second and an effective firing range of 130 feet. And for long range, she has the Remington 700 bolt-action rifle attached with a scope and holding a magazine size of 6 rounds, a maximum range of 1200 feet and a muzzle velocity of 2400 feet a second. I unfortunately don't know what kind of bullet she chooses to use, as there is no less than 15 different compatible ammunition types. However, all of them are around 7mm in bullet diameter. Both of these survivors carry a decent selection of weapons that would cover basic needs in combat. Both wield a single-edged blade that are about the same length, with Ellie's knife being about an inch longer. However, the actual blade of Clementine's knife is longer and wider than Ellie's, which would make it more effective in close-range combat. As much as I love Berettas, Ellie's gun just isn't as good. It uses the same ammunition and has 10 more feet of range, but that's honestly trivial compared to 7x7 extra bullets to fire before needing to reload, giving Clem the better pistol. Their shotguns are the same. Yeah, really, they both use the Remington 870. The only difference is that Clem's model has a collapsible stock. Aside from that, I have nothing to compare. It's literally the same model of gun. Honestly, Clementine's bow is a sympathy weapon to make up for the fact that I didn't have a real long-range weapon to give her. Ellie's rifle has better range, a faster rate of fire, and can hold 6 rounds before needing to reload, and has far more damage output. So, while Ellie has long-range covered, Clementine would have the advantage for mid and close-range combat, giving her the overall edge for weapons and equipment. Clementine learned to survive from many people throughout her life. Lee would teach her to shoot a gun, Krista taught her to take care of herself, Kenny taught her that sometimes you need to be brutal, and Jane taught her that the only person you could rely on was yourself. For close-range fights, Clementine grew up knowing from experience the disadvantage in most fights and taught herself to compensate for this, learning that instead of trying to fight on their terms, she would need to create or take advantage of openings to get the upper hand. While no gunslinger, Clementine had been shooting guns since she was 8 and is still capable in firefight. Forced to adapt to walkers only going down by shots to the head would train her instincts to go exclusively for kill shots. Clementine is also highly adaptable, able to change her approach depending on the situation, depending on what the situation calls for, implementing force or stealth as needed. Being capable of going to a shootout, to a fist fight, to sneaking around, depending on what is most advantageous to her at the moment. Being trained by Joel as a hunter, by the time she was an adult, Ellie was a highly skilled combatant, being able to engage in stealth, straight-on firefights, and even hand-to-hand combat, and being able to go toe-to-toe with or decimate trained soldiers in all of these areas. Stealth is Ellie's greatest strength in any situation. Having trained her senses to pick up on the position of any nearby targets, she uses this skill to maneuver around and eliminate those in her way, often picking off large groups one by one until either they're enough for her to take down with firepower or until none remain. She's also competent in firefights, accurately taking down entire groups of hostile survivors, implementing flanking maneuvers, stealth, and various other simple but effective tactics. Her skill in hand-to-hand combat was basic but effective, dodging her opponents before slashing at them with her switchblade to stun them, leaving them open for a finishing blow, usually by a stab to the neck or chest. However, against properly trained combatants, she tends to fall short, as Abby Anderson, a trained WLF soldier, was able to throw her around and disarm her, beating her nearly to death. And even after being starved and dehydrated by the Rattlers, Abby was still capable of putting up a fight that resulted in Ellie being permanently maimed, losing 2 of her fingers. She's also very adaptable, able to craft new weapons while under fire or laying and luring her targets into traps, and has even taken weapons out of her opponent's hands while killing them with them. Both of these girls grew up in the apocalypse and as such learned early on to keep themselves alive by any means, but one learned to be far more aggressive and deadly, which will play heavily into her hands. Starting off with something I actually didn't bring up, these two have roughly the same amount of combat experience, with Clementine having to fend for herself from the age of 11, whereas Ellie didn't start fighting regularly until she was 14, giving them both 5 years to develop their own style. But Clem does have the very slight advantage, having learned to shoot at only 8, though this is pretty minor as both are excellent shots. While their hand-to-hand combat tactics are similar, their skill is far from equal. While Clementine can hold her own, Ellie is skilled enough to pressure, control, and kill other skilled fighters with her blade alone, or even more skilled opponents as shown in her fights with Abby. As I said, both are great shots. Their tactics in a firefight differ greatly and not evenly. Clementine is mainly a defensive fighter, getting into a secure position and holding off her attackers, while Ellie is constantly on the move, getting the drop on her of enemies or forcing a firefight when she is ready for one. Ellie is also far more adaptable, having the knowledge needed to make several types of tools and combats and use them effectively. While Clementine can adapt to what changes are made in a fight, Ellie is the one that can make these changes on the fly and ultimately control the fight. As a fighter, Ellie is quite literally holding all of the cards, while Clementine doesn't even know what game they're playing. To put it simply, and to steal a line from Brian over at 3 Topics Gamer, Ellie acts while Clementine reacts, which is the exact wrong way to fight Ellie. If you want to beat this girl, you need to be more proactive than her, keeping enough pressure to force her into the sort of fight you want. And even if you can, you'd better be ready for Ellie to put up one hell of a fight before she goes down. But to be blunt, this isn't something Clementine would ever be capable of doing. It's also worth noting that the only person to ever successfully do this was not only a trained soldier, but was one of, if not the best soldier in her faction. There is no question that Ellie gets the dominating edge for combat skills and tactics. Let's set up this fight. Let's say that it takes place in Willamette Mall while Ellie is on her way to Abby in Santa Barbara and Clem is wandering with AJ, still not having found a home. Ellie carefully moves through the mall. While she thinks she took care of the last infected, she isn't taking any risks. Moving into an abandoned store and finding what looks to be an abandoned camp, entering and finding cans of food. She goes to grab one when suddenly a shot rings out. Ellie then scrambles behind the counter, pulling her pistol and calling out, "What the fuck? Not even a warning?" Ellie was about to return fire when another voice answered back, "That was your warning. Most people wouldn't be so nice after finding you in their camp." Clementine says, keeping her gun trained on the counter. I don't know who you are, but you need to drop whatever you took and leave. Ellie sits in contemplation. On one hand, the food wasn't hers. If she took it, she was no better than the bandits. But on the other hand, she hadn't eaten in weeks. She'd need to be in good shape if she was gonna kill Abby. Ellie swallows her morals and racking her shotgun, hoping the kid would run if she fought back. Hearing this, Clementine tells AJ to run and takes cover. Ellie opens fire into a wall, hoping Clementine will back out, but is instead hit in the shoulder when Clem fires back. Ellie, knowing she needs to get into a better position, blind fires as she rushes into the back. Clementine enters the hallway and, seeing a trail of blood, slowly follows until she leaves the hall into an open, realizing too late that she's been left exposed as a bullet hits her in the back. She drops her shotgun before even having the chance to use it and spins around to return fire, but quickly changes plans when she sees Ellie raising her own shotgun and ducks just in time to avoid losing her head. She runs into cover, narrowly avoiding another buckshot. Looking back, she sees Ellie reload her gun and takes the chance, opens fire. Ellie drops her Remington and falls flat, pulling her pistol and shooting several rounds, hitting Clementine once in the leg. The younger girl, running on adrenaline, powers through the pain and returns fire, almost hitting Ellie in the skull. Ellie gets up, making a run for the shotgun, but Clementine reaches her, kneeing her in the gut. Ellie has the wind knocked out of her and tries to shoot Clementine, but is forced to move Clementine's gun as she's almost shot in the face at point-blank range. The two struggle, but Ellie, being better trained, gets the upper hand and throws Clementine to the ground right next to her shotgun. Clementine, thinking fast, grabs the gun and turns it on Ellie, pulling the trigger, only to realize that she hadn't grabbed her shotgun, she had grabbed Ellie's, which was now empty. Ellie doesn't miss the irony and chuckles, grabbing her own gun, aiming it at Clementine. Well, ain't that lucky, she'd ask, pulling the trigger, only for her own gun to click, signifying that it had run dry. What? Fucking really? She doesn't have long as Clementine gets up, pulling her knife and cutting Ellie across the stomach. Clementine keeps the pressure, going in to stab her, but Ellie dodges and pulls her own blade, slashing Clementine in the arm. The two circle each other, neither wanting to make the first move, but Ellie, growing impatient, takes a stab at Clementine and jumps back. However, with her injured leg, she stumbles, giving Ellie enough time to stab her in the side. Clementine tries to get some hits in of her own, but Ellie, having leverage, pushes her to the ground and gets ready to finish her when a runner comes in, crashing into Ellie. Clementine uses this opportunity to reload her pistol and takes aim just as Ellie gets a hold of the runner, using it as a shield. As Clem pumps hot lead into the runner, Ellie reloads and drags the fresh corpse with her until she's close enough to make a break for some stairs. Clementine follows, realizing once again that she's been left out in the open, and takes cover in the food court and readies her bow. Ellie watches from a distance, taking some nearby material, and creates a Molotov cocktail. Now moving to a better position, Ellie lines up a shot with a rifle, but misses, giving away her position. Clementine spins around, but Ellie is already back out of sight. Clem slowly moves, ready to put an arrow in Ellie's heart, but she doesn't pop back up, instead throwing her Molotov at Clementine, who is forced to jump out of the way into the open. Ellie lines up another shot as Clementine pulls the string on her bow, and both fire, hitting each other. Ellie is hit in the arm, but Clementine is shot right in the gut. Clementine drops down, grabbing a wall to help herself stand, but by the time she's up, Ellie has rushed in and slams into Clementine, sending them both over the railing and back to the ground. Now both on the ground, bloody and dazed, Ellie is the first to get back up and goes to kick Clementine in the face, only to miss and get a knife in her foot. In just a moment, Clementine is back up, pulling the knife out, ready for whatever Ellie is going for. Both girls limp closer to each other, and Ellie, having grown in rage, rushes Clementine with a snarl. Clem manages to duck under and cuts Ellie across the arm, forcing her to drop her switchblade. Clementine then lunges at Ellie, going for a stab to the neck, but Ellie catches her, and they struggle for the knife until Clementine punches Ellie in the gut and goes for another stab. Ellie, unable to move, is forced to use her arm to catch the second stab with the blade going through her forearm. She tries to push Clementine back, but they're at a stalemate. So Ellie, taking notes from her opponent, kicks Clementine's injured leg out from under her before kneeing her in the gut, and now having the upper hand with Clementine on her knees clutching her stomach, brings her foot into Clementine's temple, dropping her to the ground. The younger girl tries to crawl away, but Ellie steps on her back and aims the gun at the back of her head. Sorry, but I have a kid to go home to. I need your shit. Ellie is about to finish Clementine off when the click of an empty gun alerts her to someone behind. Turning around, ready to kill, she stops, seeing AJ aiming his apparently empty revolver at her. Seeing the boy no older than 5, Ellie freezes, coming to her senses and realizing exactly what she was about to do. She steps off Clementine, backs off, unable to say a word, and in the end, she tosses a first aid kit at Clementine and walks away, determined to look somewhere else for her meal. And with that, I declare Ellie the Immune Avenger, the winner. Okay, this is another match where I'm not going to sit here and pretend I thought this fight would go any other way. In fact, I expected it to be a much bigger stomp in favor of Ellie. I was honestly surprised that Clementine was able to even hold her own against Ellie on a physical level, and outright stunned when I discovered that she had better overall equipment. However, the combat section went down exactly how I thought it would, with Clementine not being able to hold her own against Ellie at all. Realistically, Ellie simply needed to be a more aggressive fighter and had the perfect teacher in this in Joel. I can sum up this entire match in one sentence. Clementine learned to be a survivor, and Ellie learned to be a hunter. But that's just my opinion. What do you guys think? Do you agree that Ellie's better training would help her put Clementine down, or do you think that Clementine's better equipment would give her the upper hand against this immune survivor? Let me know what you think down in the comments down below. If I got anything wrong, please feel free to correct me. Also, as always, I'd like to give a shout out to the YouTubers 3 Topics Gamer and Winter Ghost, 2 other versus YouTubers whose content I highly recommend if you enjoy my own series. And if you don't know, I have a Twitter where I occasionally post updates, about upcoming videos. So follow me on there if you're interested in that. Right, with all that, I've been Rain932, and I will see all of you for the Season 2 finale.
盾つくようになったじゃねえか。
なあキュービー、俺はないつかおめえの中の憎しみもどうにかしてやりてえと思ってる。俺を散々苦しめたお前だけど、憎しみに振り回されんのがいい気がしねえってのは俺も知ってっから。
お前はバカか。わしはヒュービだぞ。わしは憎しみの塊だ。チンチクリンにどうこうされるほど押しぶれちゃいない。